What if I told you Henry VIII had a secret chamber hidden beneath his palace, where screams echoed behind stone walls and loyalty was measured in blood? For centuries, historians tried to hide this room from the public, a place where nobles, courtiers, and even friends vanished behind palace doors. Recently discovered documents reveal chilling details: iron shackles, twisted instruments, and confessions forced through terror. This wasn't just punishment. It was Henry's obsession with control, power, and fear made flesh. While the king feasted above in glittering halls, below, men and women were broken, sometimes to death, all in the name of loyalty. Tonight, we descend into the chamber they don't teach you about in school. The grand halls of Hampton Court Palace glittered with gold and laughter, but beneath the polished floors, hidden from every visitor and even many servants, a spiral stairwell wound down into darkness. Its stones were slick with centuries of damp, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the silent shaft. Only those summoned, and those brave enough, dared to descend. The air grew heavier, colder, carrying a faint metallic tang that hinted at what lay below. Henry VIII, Secret Chamber of Terror. Every flicker of torchlight made the walls come alive. Shadows stretched and twisted, sometimes appearing human, sometimes monstrous. The further you descended, the more the world above, the music, the chatter, the comfort of candlelit halls, vanished. Here, the rules of polite society dissolved. Here, Henry's absolute power reigned, silent and lethal. Even before the door closed behind you, fear had already begun its work. At the bottom of the stairs stood a massive oak door, iron-bound, worn yet impenetrable. Only a select few guards held the keys. Behind it waited a room designed to break more than bones, a space where chains hung like predators, and the floor bore scars from centuries of cruelty. Those who were brought here, rebels, traitors, even close courtiers, never entered as equals. Some emerged forever changed, others never left at all. What made the stairwell itself terrifying wasn't just its descent, but the way it whispered. Each footstep seemed to echo infinitely. Every creak of stone and flicker of torchlight became a voice of warning, a promise that pain awaited. The imagination did half the work, the chamber below would do the rest. Courtiers who approached often felt as though unseen eyes followed them down, measuring their courage, weighing their guilt. The closer you got, the tighter the walls felt, pressing not just on your body, but on your mind. Historians would later uncover faint traces of this passage. Ledgers listing bribes for silence, notes about repairs for the chains, hints of devices whose shapes they could only guess at. But no record captured what it felt like to descend into that darkness. The suffocating cold, the metallic scent, the oppressive anticipation. The stairwell itself was a prelude, a warning that obedience would be demanded, and that those who defied the king did so at unimaginable cost. To step down this spiral was to step into Henry VIII's mind. Every shadow, every echo, every chilling breeze reminded you power could be hidden, subtle, and absolute. And at the bottom, the door waited, silent, menacing, and heavy with centuries of whispered screams. The chamber itself was more than a room. It was a carefully crafted prison of the mind. Stone walls rose high and unyielding, swallowing torchlight and sound alike, turning even the smallest footstep into a deafening echo. The ceiling, low and unforgiving in places, forced those who entered to bow, as if the building itself demanded submission. Every element, from the rough-hewn floor to the iron brackets along the walls, was designed to intimidate before a single instrument of pain was even touched. In one corner sat the rack, its beams polished smooth from decades of use, metal chains dangling like vipers ready to strike. In another hung shackles of varying sizes, clinking faintly, even when untouched, as if mocking the fear that trembled in the hearts of visitors. A table scarred with deep grooves and stains told a story older than any ledger. The room was alive with memory, with every mark a testament to the suffering it had witnessed. It was a place that demanded respect, obedience, and terror. But the architecture wasn't just about instruments. It was about isolation. Small windows, if they existed at all, were set high, too narrow to offer light or escape. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of damp stone, iron, and human fear. The walls seemed to close in with every passing minute, and every sound was amplified. A creak in the floor, the faint whisper of chains, the distant groan of someone testing their limits. Even those who were brave felt their courage erode with each step. The room itself became a participant in the torture, whispering threats louder than any guard or device. Henry VIII understood that fear was most effective when invisible. The instruments of torment were horrifying, yes, but it was the anticipation, the psychological weight of the chamber, that made it deadly. A prisoner could spend hours listening to the chains rattle, imagining what would happen next, imagining faces in the shadows that were never truly there. The architecture amplified doubt, anxiety, and dread, turning mere space into a weapon. It wasn't enough that someone might be punished. The room ensured that even the thought of punishment could destroy the mind. The placement of the chamber beneath the palace was deliberate. Above, courtiers laughed in halls glittering with gold and candlelight, unaware of the horrors that lay just steps below their feet. The contrast was cruel and deliberate. The king's public face was generosity and charm, but below, every corner, every stone, and every shadow reinforced his private dominion. It was a kingdom within a kingdom, ruled by fear, silence, and the inevitability of suffering. By the time a prisoner was brought into this room, the architecture had already done half the work. Every shiver of cold stone, every echoing footstep, every flicker of torchlight whispered the same message. Defiance was deadly. Submission was not optional. And as the heavy oak door closed behind them, the chamber's design, cold, unyielding, and precise, made it clear. In Henry VIII's world, obedience was carved into stone. The chamber was never empty for long. Men and women of every rank passed through its iron gates, though few survived to speak of what they saw. Some were rebels, accused of plotting against the king. Others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Courtiers whose loyalty was questioned, friends whose words were misheard, or servants whose obedience faltered for a single moment. Each one entered the room, knowing that once the oak door closed behind them, the world above would forget they ever existed. Thomas More, once the king's trusted counselor, felt the chill of these walls in his mind long before he ever stepped into their shadows. Though he was spared the full measure of the chamber's devices, interrogations dragged on for days, leaving him exhausted, broken, and constantly under threat. His crime was refusing to bow to Henry's religious reforms, and that refusal alone was enough to warrant terror. He understood, as did every courtier, that disobedience was not simply punished. It was consumed, gnawed at, and twisted until the spirit bent before the body. Then there was Anne Askew, young, defiant, and fearless in her faith. Accused of heresy for embracing Protestant beliefs, she endured the chamber's cruelest devices. Her body was stretched, compressed, and forced to betray itself before the king's appointed officers. Yet even in agony, Anne's mind remained sharp, each breath of pain tempered by conviction. Her story was a rare one, a reminder that fear could bend some, but not all. Her courage left a mark on history, even if the chamber sought to erase her. Other prisoners were less fortunate. Noblemen who had angered Henry over trifles disappeared, dragged into darkness without witnesses, leaving only whispers of their fate. Their families waited for letters that never came, hearing rumors that chilled the blood, chains, racks, walls soaked in tears, and instruments of cruelty that the mind struggles to imagine. The chamber was as much about erasing the person as it was about extracting obedience. By the time the guards released the next victim, the echo of screams from the previous occupant had already begun to sink into the walls, haunting every corner, every shadow. Even servants and minor courtiers learned to live in fear of their footsteps, knowing that a single misstep could land them in the chamber. Each day became a careful performance, smiling when commanded, speaking only when spoken to, and never questioning the king's whims. It was a place where loyalty was tested, not through words, but through endurance. A silent, merciless examination of courage, faith, and fear. By the time a prisoner left, if they ever did, they were never the same. Eyes carried the weight of what had been endured. Bodies bore invisible scars. Minds trembled at shadows, and sounds that reminded them of the stairs, the door, the chains. For Henry VIII, these were not punishments of the body alone. They were lessons in obedience, etched into the soul, whispered into every corner of the palace above, and carried in silence by those who survived. Beneath the echoing banquet halls and perfumed chambers of Whitehall, another world breathed in silence. A world of dripping stone and trembling confession. Few ever walked those halls by choice. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of cold iron and burnt tallow. Here, the flicker of a torch didn't comfort, it revealed. It caught the glint of wet steel, the curl of blackened rope, the red traces of someone else's night. They said the king never came here himself. But the truth whispered otherwise. Servants swore they'd seen his shadow at the stair, broad shoulders framed by the light above, face unreadable, eyes reflecting flame. Sometimes the music above would swell, lutes, laughter, the sound of goblets clinking. And beneath it all, muffled, rhythmic screams would drift upward, absorbed by the stone before reaching royal ears. But not his. Henry listened. Not out of mercy, nor horror, but curiosity. There was something about pain that fascinated him. The way a man broke, not all at once, but in slow surrender. The way truth melted from the tongue when terror sank its claws deep enough. The chamber below became his mirror. Up above, he ruled through charm and ceremony. Down here, through silence and shadow. Both faces of the same crown. A chronicler once described how the king's court turned colder after nightfall. Candles burned lower. Jesters grew quiet. The queen's ladies whispered of footsteps that echoed too long after midnight. Boots heavy, measured, descending into the dark. One guard, years later, confessed before his death that he had been stationed outside the door of the lowest vault. He remembered the sound, a low hum, like a man praying or laughing. When he finally dared to glance through the iron grate, he saw a figure at the center of the room, not the prisoner, the king himself, and on the wall behind him, marks. Deep gouges, carved by hand, initials of those who never left. The next morning, the king held mass as if nothing had happened. Gold, incense, and silk erased the night. But the eyes that met his across the altar, his courtiers, his wives, his servants, carried questions none dared to ask. Because in Henry's England, silence was survival. And somewhere underfoot, that silence still breathes, waiting for the sound of boots on stone once more. The cell door groaned open, with a sound like bones grinding. He didn't remember how long it had been. Days, perhaps weeks, since they dragged him below Whitehall. Down past the kitchens, past the dripping arches, past the warmth of bread, and the smell of life. Down into the hollow place where the air grew thick and time itself began to rot. The guards never spoke. They only listened to the sound of their own footsteps, to the faint hiss of the torches. The prisoner had stopped asking questions long ago. But tonight, something was different. There were more torches lit than usual, more shadows moving, and among them, a new one, broad, still, heavy with presence. He didn't have to see the face to know who it was. The king had come. The man on the floor tried to rise, but the chains were too tight. His wrists had grown pale and slick from the iron's bite. He wanted to speak, to plead, but his mouth was too dry. The words stayed trapped in his throat, like moths in a jar. Henry's boots stopped inches away. No guard spoke, no one dared breathe. The only sound was the slow drip of water somewhere in the dark, keeping rhythm with his pulse. Then the king spoke, not to him, but to the man in the shadows, holding the crank. Continue. The word echoed through the chamber, low and deliberate. The prisoner's body twisted as the ropes pulled tighter. A strangled cry tore itself from his chest, breaking the quiet. The king didn't flinch. His eyes stayed fixed, not on the man, but on the mechanism, on how it moved, how it made flesh obey metal. He stepped closer. The torchlight caught his face, a strange calm, almost scholarly, the way a man studies his own reflection in a pool. Pain, he murmured softly. reveals the truth that words cannot." The guards said nothing. They had heard that line before. The prisoner's vision blurred. Through the haze, he saw the king lean in slightly, his shadow merging with his own. He thought he saw pity, just for a breath, but then it was gone. When it was over, the king turned away, his cloak brushing the damp stone. "Dispose of him before dawn," he said quietly. No records, and as Henry's footsteps receded, the man with the crank finally spoke, his voice trembling like a prayer. "He never remembers their names." Somewhere above, Whitehall glittered with laughter and wine. The candles were lit, the dancers spun, and the scent of roasted swan filled the air. But beneath the music, beneath the marble, the screams still echoed, caught between stone and history. By daylight, Whitehall shimmered like a crown set upon the Thames. The palace walls glowed honey gold in the morning sun. Banners swayed in the wind, and music drifted faintly from the courtyards. Courtiers glided through corridors perfumed with rose water, their laughter echoing between tapestries of saints and battles long won. To an outsider, it was paradise, wealth woven into every inch of air. But paradise always hides its rot. Thomas Lenton knew that better than most. He was a royal clerk, a man whose hands smelled of ink and parchment instead of power. His job was simple: record the decrees, the taxes, the trials. Keep the crown's memory clean. Yet lately, that memory had begun to bleed. 3 prisoners, gone. No burial, no pardon. No note of transfer to the Tower. Simply erased, like smudges rubbed from a page. Thomas checked, and rechecked, and finally stopped sleeping. Then came the first midnight order. It arrived without warning. Parchment sealed in crimson wax bearing the royal crest. The messenger would never speak, only bow, hand it over, and vanish into the dark. Each letter carried the same command: remove from ledger, burn the name. At first, Thomas obeyed. Who was he to question the king? But curiosity gnawed at him, and fear's leash grew slack. The orders came too often. Sometimes he thought he smelled smoke long before the wax seal cooled. One evening, when the bells tolled curfew, and the palace dimmed to whispers, he decided to follow the messenger. He moved like a shadow through the servants' passageways, past the kitchens where embers still glowed, down the narrow stone stairwell that led below the chapel. The air thickened with every step. The scent changed. Less incense, more iron. And somewhere beneath, faintly, a sound, the echo of chains drawn slow and deliberate. Torches lined the final corridor. Their light quivered on damp walls carved with marks, names scratched halfway through, then abandoned. The sight made Thomas's stomach twist. He reached a small wooden door and pressed his ear to it. Voices murmured inside. Guards, perhaps, or confessors. Then another voice joined them, calm and unmistakable. The king. Pain reveals the truth that words cannot, Henry said, his tone almost tender. Thomas dared to peer through a narrow slit in the wall. Inside, torches burned low. A man hung bound by his wrists, face pale beneath streaks of blood. The king stood beside him, studying the contraption that turned sinew to confession. He didn't look angry. He looked fascinated, like a scholar dissecting a mystery. The prisoner's scream rose, and Henry stepped back, watching as if the sound itself were music. Then, stillness. The king turned slightly. For a moment too long, his eyes met Thomas's through the slit. Cold recognition. A faint smile. Nothing more. Thomas stumbled backward, his candle flickering. He fled up the stairwell, heart pounding against his ribs, each step echoing like a drumbeat of guilt. By the time he reached the hallway above, the air smelled of roses again. Laughter floated from the great hall, as if nothing beneath existed. But when he returned to his chamber, a parchment waited upon his desk, sealed, warm, crimson. He already knew what it said before he broke the wax. Remove from ledger, burn the name. And this time, the name written was his own. The wax on the parchment was still warm when Thomas dropped it. It rolled across the desk like a drop of blood, leaving a thin red streak on the polished wood. He stood frozen, pulse roaring in his ears. The candlelight wavered. His name. He'd seen it clearly enough. Remove from ledger. Burn the name. A command from the king himself. For a long moment, he couldn't move. Every instinct screamed to obey, to burn the paper, erase the evidence, and pretend nothing existed. That was what everyone did. But now, every breath felt heavier, every shadow alive. The words wouldn't stop repeating in his mind. Burn the name. Burn the name. He snatched the parchment and hid it inside his robe. His hands were trembling as he blew out the candle and stepped into the corridor. The palace was sleeping, mostly. But in Henry's court, sleep never meant safety. He passed silent guards, their faces blank as carved stone. Down the long gallery, moonlight pooled across the floor like silver water. He paused beneath a portrait of the king, broad, resplendent, immortalized in crimson and gold. The painted eyes seemed to follow him. Thomas turned away. He knew the risk. To disobey a royal order was treason. To know what he knew was worse. But he couldn't die with the truth buried in him. Not after seeing what lay beneath. Someone had to know. Someone outside these walls. He hurried toward the archive vault. If he could copy the king's signature, the seal, and the order, just enough to prove what he'd seen, he could flee before dawn. The ships at Southwark would be leaving with the tide. But when he reached the vault, the door was already open. Torchlight flickered inside. A man stood at the table, broad-shouldered, wearing the crimson and gold of the royal household. His gloved hand rested on the desk, fingers spread beside an unrolled parchment. It was Thomas's ledger. "Looking for this?" the man asked softly. Thomas froze. He recognized him, the Lord Chancellor's aide, one of the king's most trusted enforcers. "I was ordered to review the ledgers," Thomas managed to say, his voice barely holding. The man's eyes gleamed with amusement. "Yes," he said. "By His Majesty himself. He takes a keen interest in his records, you know. Even omissions." He gestured toward the parchment Thomas had hidden. "Hand it over." Thomas hesitated, then bolted. He heard a shout behind him, boots pounding on the stone. He ran through the corridor, the cold air cutting his throat, heart battering his ribs. He didn't think, only moved. Down the servants' stairs, past the kitchens, through the side door that led toward the Thames. Outside, fog hung thick and silent. The city slept, but the river stirred, black, endless, a whispering expanse of escape. He made it as far as the embankment before he saw them. 2 guards stood waiting by the water, torches flaring red in the mist. The man in crimson followed behind, slow and calm. "You should have burned it," he said quietly. Thomas clutched the parchment to his chest. "Someone will know," he whispered. "They'll find this. They'll know what he's done." The man smiled faintly. "No," he said. "They'll find nothing at all." The torchlight flared, and the world turned white. By morning, the Thames carried nothing but ash and fog. And in the royal ledger, one more name was missing. It began with dust. Centuries later, the royal palace was no longer a fortress of dread, but a monument of history. Tourists passed beneath its arches, cameras flashing where candles once burned, and the corridors that had echoed with screams now whispered only with the footsteps of curators and guides. In the West Wing, long sealed after a roof collapse, scaffolding clung to the ancient stone like cobwebs of iron. Restoration had begun after decades of neglect. The workers moved carefully, lifting debris, cataloguing fragments of carved wood, shattered tiles, rusted hinges. Nothing unusual, until they found the wall. It was hidden behind an ornamental tapestry, one no record mentioned. When they peeled it back, they saw faint seams running along the stone, barely visible beneath centuries of grime. The foreman tapped it with the handle of his hammer. The sound was hollow. A false wall. Behind it lay a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the dark. The air that rushed out smelled of wax and old iron. They called for the chief conservator, Dr. Amelia Ward. A scholar of Tudor architecture, She'd spent her life studying the palace's construction, tracing its forgotten corridors through maps and whispers. When she arrived, she stared at the opening with quiet awe. "This shouldn't be here," she murmured. The staircase descended beneath the old treasury, an area that, according to every surviving plan, ended in solid stone. Yet the air below felt vast, open, alive with echoes. Amelia lowered a lantern and saw the glint of metal. Chains, perhaps, or something worse. By the next morning, a small team had cleared the way. Dust swirled in their lights as they descended into the hidden chamber. The space opened suddenly. An underground room, half collapsed, lined with ancient shelves. Books and scrolls had turned to pulp, but something survived. A small iron coffer, sealed with the royal insignia of King Henry VIII. No one spoke for several seconds. Amelia approached slowly. The seal was broken with care, the lid creaking as it lifted. Inside lay a bundle of parchments wrapped in faded cloth, their edges burned, as if someone had tried, and failed, to destroy them. The top page bore a single phrase, written in a hurried, desperate hand. "The red ledger must never see light." The ink had bled through the fibers like veins. Amelia turned another page and froze. A name was listed there, then another, then another. Rows of them, each crossed out in heavy red wax. And at the bottom, the same signature repeated in a sweeping, regal hand. Henry Rex. One of the archaeologists laughed softly, uneasy. "Looks like someone kept good records," he said. Amelia didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on a dark stain spreading across the parchment. Not ink, something older. Something that had dried too thick, too brown. For the first time in years, she felt the palace breathe around her. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, the silence pressing close. "Oh, pack it carefully," she whispered. "And don't speak of it yet." But outside, the storm had already begun. By nightfall, news of the discovery had leaked. "Hidden room found beneath Tudor palace," the headline said. "Scholars unearth secret chamber." No one knew yet what they had found. No one knew what waited inside the red ledger. By the second week, the palace had changed. The lights in the west wing flickered without reason. Security cameras froze at odd hours. The workers complained of headaches, of feeling watched. Even the air smelled strange. Thick, metallic, almost sweet. Dr. Amelia Ward dismissed the talk at first. Old buildings, she reminded them, have tempers. Drafts move like ghosts, and wiring from the 1950s tends to protest when disturbed. But even she could not explain the sounds. They came late at night, soft metallic groans echoing beneath the floors. Once, Amelia swore she heard a slow, dragging sound, like chains being pulled across stone. Still, she pressed on. The red ledger had been carefully relocated to a conservation lab, kept under glass, humidity controlled, lights low. Every page was photographed, scanned, and examined. There were nearly 70 entries, each written in two distinct hands. One belonged to a royal scribe, the other unmistakably to the king himself. The first pages described prisoners, not political rivals or traitors, but artisans, blacksmiths, apothecaries. Men and women brought to the palace under private order. Each entry ended the same way. Subject concluded, facility secured. But what facility? There was no mention of it in any known record. No wing, no annex, no dungeon by that name. Yet, line after line, Henry's orders grew stranger. Instruments revised. Confession incomplete. Pain yields obedience. Amelia read in silence for hours, her fingers trembling slightly each time she turned the page. Then, halfway through the ledger, the handwriting changed. The smooth royal script began to shake, letters uneven, ink spattered. The words became desperate, erratic. "He will not sleep. The screams return through the walls. The floor moves. I see him still, even in prayer." Amelia stopped breathing for a moment. She adjusted the light, leaned closer. The entry was dated 1538, the same year Henry S., chief physician, had died mysteriously after a private audience with the king. The next line chilled her completely. I hear the cries below my bed. The chamber must be sealed. It was the last entry in the book. The pages after were blank, brittle, and water-stained. That night, Amelia stayed late at the lab, reviewing notes. The building was quiet, the corridors echoing faintly. She told herself it was only exhaustion, the power of suggestion. But then she saw it. On the far wall, beneath the faint glow of the exit sign, something shifted. A shadow. At first, she thought it was her reflection, but it didn't move when she did. It lingered, just out of reach, the shape of a man with shoulders broad, neck heavy. A king's silhouette. When she turned on the light, it vanished. Amelia exhaled, half laughing at herself. She closed the ledger, locking it carefully in its case. But as she reached for her coat, she noticed something new. The glass above the ledger was fogged from the inside, and drawn there with a fingertip were 2 words. He remembers. The lab's motion sensors should have caught anyone entering. They hadn't. She stood there for a long moment, frozen between logic and terror. Then, as if on cue, the power went out. For 2 heartbeats, the palace was completely dark. When the emergency lights finally flickered on again, the ledger was open, and a single page had been torn free. Not in person. Of course, that was impossible. Henry VIII had been dead for centuries, but the air in the hidden chamber beneath Whitehall carried his presence like a shadow pressed into stone. Every beam, every carved arch seemed to echo his footsteps. The very walls remembered. The ledger had led her here, each entry a breadcrumb to a darkness that refused to die. The missing page, the one torn free in the lab, contained coordinates, notes in Henry's own hand, about a special chamber hidden beneath the old wine cellars. Torch in hand, Amelia descended the spiral staircase into the basement corridors. The stone grew colder the deeper she went, damp against her fingertips. Faint scratches marred the walls, old, desperate, like Henry had carved them in frustration, or maybe in warning. And then she saw it. The door. Heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands. A crude inscription had been chiseled into it. Private. His Majesty's use only. She paused. The air seemed to shift. A chill pressed against her spine, whispering of past screams. In her mind's eye, she could see him, broad-shouldered, red doublet gleaming, fingers tracing the instruments with meticulous curiosity. The king who had ordered the screams, who had measured obedience in pain, who had never forgotten a face once it had passed beneath his gaze. Amelia pushed the door. It creaked open slowly, revealing the chamber. The room was preserved in shadow. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling. Iron devices, their purpose grotesque, lined the walls. And in the center, a raised platform of stone, worn smooth by centuries of feet, some royal, some terrified. The ledger trembled in her hands. She opened it to the final entry, Henry's last note. The memory of him is my own. No one may leave without acknowledging the debt. The chamber sees all. I see all. She shivered. The words carried more than ink. They carried obsession, cruelty, the pulse of a man who had once lived and ruled above, now trapped in paper and stone. Then, faintly, she heard it. A metallic scrape. Her lantern flickered, and for a brief heartbeat, the shadow of a man appeared across the far wall. Broad shoulders, red doublet, massive silhouette. Not alive, not moving, yet unmistakably him. Henry VIII. Her breath caught. She thought of the ledger's missing page, of the names erased, of the screams that had once echoed here. And for a second, she felt the king's eyes on her, as if he were measuring her courage, or her worthiness to witness. Amelia steadied herself. She set the ledger down carefully, photographing every detail. The shadows clung closer as she worked. She realized something terrifying. The king's presence wasn't merely memory. It was obsession. Every order, every command, every cruel curiosity had imprinted itself on this place. It had survived centuries in stone and ink, and now, through her discovery, it had awakened again. When she finally left the chamber, The torchlight from the stairwell behind her stretched like fingers, as if Henry himself was reaching, watching, waiting. The palace above glittered with normality, indifferent to the darkness beneath. But she knew the truth. Henry VIII had never truly left Whitehall, and anyone who dared unearth his secrets risked seeing him, as he had once always seen them. The air in the hidden chamber felt alive, as if it had been waiting. Dr. Amelia Ward crouched over the stone platform, the red ledger open before her. Every name, every command, every red wax mark told a story. But the last section of the ledger promised something far darker. A final entry, scrawled in Henry VIII's unmistakable hand, directed her to a smaller, sealed doorway at the far end of the chamber. The inscription was simple: "For the king's eyes only. No witness remains." Her fingers trembled as she pushed against the heavy oak. It gave slightly, a groan of iron and centuries-old wood. Inside, the space was cramped, almost claustrophobic. A faint metallic odor filled her nose, thick and unrelenting. The light of her torch revealed racks of iron instruments she had never seen before. Some bent, some sharp, all designed to make flesh scream and bone surrender. Then she noticed it. A basin, large enough to hold a man, stained dark along the edges. She knelt to examine it. The surface was cracked, the remnants of old liquid darkened to black. In the corner, a pile of tattered clothing hinted at past victims. Aprons, boots, belts, all curled in decay. And there, carved into the stone wall behind the basin, were initials, hundreds of them. Letters scratched with meticulous care. Names of those who had entered the chamber and never left. Her lantern flickered. A chill rose through her body. She could almost hear it. The subtle dragging of chains, the muffled cries, the whisper of Henry's voice as he leaned close to measure terror. His words echoing across the centuries. Pain reveals the truth that words cannot. Amelia backed away, heart hammering, but something compelled her to look further. Beneath the basin, in a narrow slit in the stone, lay a small iron chest. Rust had consumed much of it, but the royal seal was intact. She lifted the lid slowly, her hands shaking. Inside were scrolls, parchments, and what appeared to be a bound human ledger, a record so meticulous it made her stomach turn. Each page detailed exactly what Henry had done to each prisoner, the instruments used, the duration of their confinement, the exact phrase whispered before each interrogation. There were sketches, some crude, some alarmingly precise, of the devices themselves, and then, at the very end, a notation that made her blood run cold. "He who survives owes me his silence. None leave without acknowledgement. I see all. I remember all." The words were underlined multiple times, in ink thick and dark, as though Henry himself had pressed the pen too hard, desperate to ensure the message lasted forever. Amelia staggered back, realizing the ledger was not just a record. It was a shrine to obsession, to cruelty, to power beyond morality. Henry VIII had not merely ruled with fear above ground. He had constructed a world of terror below, leaving it to endure through centuries, hiding in plain sight. Her lantern flickered again, and for a heartbeat, the shadows behind her lengthened unnaturally. The faint outline of a broad man in doublet seemed to move across the walls, impossibly silent. Amelia's breath caught. She knew, without turning, that he was watching. Still, Henry VIII, alive in obsession, bound to the chamber he had created, immortalized in ink and stone. The red ledger was proof. The chamber was proof. And now she understood. The king had waited all this time for someone to uncover it. The chamber breathed. Torchlight flickered along the damp stone walls, casting long shadows that danced like prisoners themselves. The air smelled of iron, smoke, and something older, decay that had soaked into the foundation. In the center, Henry VIII stood, broad and formidable, doublet crimson, sword belt glinting faintly. His gaze swept the room like a storm, piercing, relentless. A man knelt before him, wrists chained, eyes wide with terror. Every breath trembled, every muscle tight with anticipation. Henry circled slowly, like a predator savoring the hunt, boots clicking on the cold stone floor. "Do you understand why you are here?" Henry's voice rumbled, low and precise. It was both a question and a judgment. The prisoner's lips quivered. No sound coming. Henry smiled faintly, as if pleased. "No matter," he said. He lifted a hand, gesturing toward a device gleaming in the torchlight. A wheel of iron, polished, cruel. "The truth will speak, one way or another." The chains rattled. The man gasped. The wheel gleamed, reflecting Henry's eyes. Dark, calculating, merciless. Henry leaned close, his shadow swallowing the prisoner. "Pain," he murmured, almost reverently, "is a language even fools understand. A tongue more honest than your lies." The room was silent, save for the drip of water from the ceiling. The torches flickered violently, elongating Henry's silhouette. For a moment, it seemed the chamber itself obeyed him, bending light and shadow to his will. He stepped back and surveyed the walls, where iron hooks and racks awaited. Each tool told a story of obedience and suffering, a record etched in cruelty. Henry's eyes lingered on a chain hanging from the ceiling, imagining the swing, the resistance, the inevitable surrender of flesh. He circled the room again, slow, deliberate, as if tasting the fear in the air. "Every face is a promise," he said quietly, "and every scream, a confession." The prisoner's knees hit the floor, sweat glistening on pale skin. The scent of fear was thick in the room, mingling with the metallic tang of old wounds. Henry paused, hands clasped behind his back, observing, calculating. Above the stone, the chamber seemed ordinary, but below it was a stage of terror, a cathedral of obedience. Every echo, every drop of water, every flicker of fire belonged to him. Henry was not just king. Here, he was omnipotent, omniscient, eternal. He gestured toward a table where instruments lay meticulously arranged. Pliers, pincers, twisted hooks. "Order," he whispered, "is found in precision." He picked up a slender tool, turning it in his fingers. The light caught the steel, gleaming red from torchlight. A hush fell over the room. The prisoner's pulse thundered in his ears, synchronized with the king's slow, deliberate breaths. Henry stepped forward, close enough that the man could feel the heat radiating from his body. Then, just for a moment, the king's expression softened, calm, almost contemplative. And in that moment, the horror deepened. The mercy was not genuine. It was deliberate, calculated, part of the ritual of fear. Henry turned to the far wall, where marks of past prisoners carved the stone. "Each one," he said, voice echoing, "teaches a lesson. And I remember every lesson." He faced the prisoner again, towering, immovable, a god in red doublet. The torchlight caught his jeweled ring, glinting, cold. The shadow of his body stretched across the walls, enveloping the room, swallowing the man's terror entirely. The chamber waited. And so did Henry, because in his domain, darkness was law, pain was language, and obedience was eternal. The chamber pulsed with anticipation. Henry VIII stood over the bound man, boots pressing lightly into the cold stone, crimson doublet darkened by torchlight. Every movement was deliberate, measured, like a composer conducting a symphony of fear. Chains rattled softly as the prisoner struggled, but Henry's gaze never wavered. On the table lay a parade of instruments, gleaming iron, cruelly twisted, polished to a deadly shine. Pliers, pincers, hooks, and a wheel that seemed to swallow light. Each one reflected Henry's meticulous obsession, each one a promise of suffering. The prisoner whimpered, voice cracking like dry wood. Henry crouched slightly, his shadow engulfing him. "Do you know why you are here?" he asked, calm, almost gentle. "No? Then listen well. Pain reveals the truths your tongue could never confess." He reached for a pair of curved pliers. The steel caught the torchlight, glinting red. The prisoner's eyes widened, breath shallow, body trembling. Henry walked slowly around him, boots echoing on stone. "Every scream is a sentence," he murmured. "Every plea, a lesson." His shadow stretched across the walls, merging with the rack and chains, swallowing the prisoner in darkness. He placed the pliers on the table beside a small basin. The basin's dark stains told silent stories of those who had come before. Henry's hand hovered over it, almost reverent. The faint scent of iron filled the room, mingling with the prisoner's fear. The prisoner tried to look away, to shrink into the shadows. Henry's eyes followed him like a hawk's. "Do not waste your energy," he said softly. "Obedience is measured in endurance, not in flight." He moved to the wall, tracing fingers over the scratches left by past captives. Names etched in trembling hands, scores of them, reminders that memory outlives flesh. Henry paused, studied them, then turned back. His smile was faint, but it carried centuries of cruelty. The tools were chosen now. Each was an extension of his will. He picked up the wheel, iron cold against his palm. Slowly, deliberately, he positioned it, adjusting the chains. The prisoner's body jerked involuntarily, sweat glistening, tears streaking pale cheeks. Henry watched, fascinated, almost scholarly, as though he were performing an experiment. "Pain," he whispered, "is not punishment. Pain is revelation." He stepped back, surveying the chamber. Every shadow, every instrument, every corner of stone had been crafted for one purpose: absolute obedience. The prisoner's fear fed him, filled him with power. The torchlight reflected off polished metal and crimson fabric, casting a cathedral of terror around him. Then Henry leaned forward, voice low, final. "Remember, every lesson is yours to bear. Every scream echoes beyond this room. And I remember everything." The prisoner cried out, a sound that shook the stone, but Henry stood unmoved. A king, a god of pain, immortal in the moment, overseeing his domain with precision, obsession, and cold, unyielding authority. In that chamber, under flickering torchlight, Henry VIII was no longer a man. He was fear itself. Every device, every shadow, every echo belonged to him. And the prisoner knew in that moment that escape was not just impossible, it was unthinkable. The chamber waited, the torches danced, and Henry reigned. The chamber was alive with fear. Torches flickered against damp stone walls, shadows leaping and twisting, as though the room itself breathed. Henry VIII moved among his captives, a crimson figure of terrifying authority, boots echoing in measured rhythm. The air reeked of iron and sweat, of terror that had soaked into the walls centuries ago. Several prisoners knelt on the cold stone, wrists chained, bodies quivering, eyes wide and pleading. Each face was unique, yet each reflected the same raw, universal fear. Henry surveyed them with a meticulous gaze, his hands clasped behind his back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You come here thinking your sins are small," he said, voice low, resonant. "But truth reveals itself in pain. Obedience is the currency of life beneath this roof." He selected a device, a twisted iron wheel, and lifted it into torchlight. The shadows gleamed on polished steel, reflecting the prisoners' terrified faces. Chains rattled as he moved among them, a predator inspecting his prey. One man whimpered. Henry crouched slightly, studying him. "Do not waste breath with words. Breath is a gift, not a shield. You will learn to speak in silence." The prisoners shifted uneasily. Some cried softly, others stared blankly, their minds retreating to a place beyond pain. Henry walked slowly, deliberately, from one to the next, his shadow stretching across the walls, merging with the iron hooks, chains, and racks that surrounded them. He paused at the basin, darkened with old stains, and dipped his fingers in, spreading a faint sheen across his palms. Then he touched the wall, tracing initials carved by those who had come before. "Memory," he said softly, "is eternal, and I remember all." The tools on the table gleamed, arranged with obsessive precision. Henry picked up pliers, examined the curve, tested the weight. He allowed a prisoner a fleeting glance at the instruments before moving to the next, ensuring dread passed from one to another like a contagion. He leaned close to the first prisoner again, whispering, "Scream if you must, but remember, your fear is mine. Your pain is measured, recorded, eternal." The prisoners flinched at each word, their bodies contracting under invisible force. Henry's shadow seemed to stretch further with every step, consuming the torchlight, consuming the room. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, echoing every rattle, every gasp, every soft whimper. He stepped back and surveyed them all. One by one, he ensured each understood the rules: submission, observation, endurance. The instruments, the chains, the flickering shadows. They were all extensions of him. Every motion, every sigh, every heartbeat belonged to Henry. Then he raised his voice slightly, soft but firm. "Remember, each lesson learned here is not merely for survival. It is for history. Each cry, each shiver, each glance, etched into these stones, into my memory, forever." For a heartbeat, he allowed the prisoners to see the full scope of his presence. Crimson doublet, glinting rings, eyes cold, shadow long and absolute. The chamber seemed to shrink around him, alive, obedient, a cathedral of horror where he reigned eternal. Henry moved towards the shadows, vanishing into the flickering light, leaving the prisoners trembling, broken, and fully aware of the omnipresence of his obsession. The torches continued to dance, the walls whispered, the chains rattled, and Henry VIII's reign of fear endured, timeless, complete, unchallenged. The torches flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across the chamber. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting as though alive with memory. Henry VIII's silhouette stretched impossibly long, crimson doublet vivid in the wavering light. His boots clicked slowly on the stone, echoing in rhythm with the prisoners' racing hearts. The prisoners huddled together, trembling, eyes darting to every corner. Chains rattled softly. The instruments glinted with cruel anticipation, arranged as meticulously as any royal plan. Henry surveyed them all, calm, precise, and utterly terrifying. "Do you understand now?" His voice resonated, low and final. "This chamber, this room, every corner, every chain, every mark in the stone belongs to me. Every fear, every scream, my witness." A prisoner whimpered. Henry's shadow enveloped him. He stepped forward, hand resting on the hilt of his dagger, then slowly removed it, letting the threat hang in the torchlit air. "Pain is temporary," he whispered, "but memory endures." The chamber seemed to respond to his presence. Shadows deepened. The torches flickered as though stirred by some invisible hand. The air grew colder, heavier, smelling faintly of iron and old despair. Henry walked past the basin, glancing at the stains of centuries, then to the wall where names of the vanished were carved in trembling scratches. His fingers traced the initials lightly, reverently almost, as if communing with those who had suffered. One by one, the prisoners' bodies shook, mind and flesh tethered to his will. Henry moved slowly among them, inspecting, observing, his shadow swallowing the light. Every motion was deliberate, every gaze measured. Obedience was not a choice. It was the law of this space. He paused, standing at the center of the chamber. Torchlight gleamed off his jeweled ring. Crimson doublet like blood in the shadows. Chains rattled softly, like whispered confessions. "Remember," he said, voice carrying across stone, "you may leave this room, but the chamber leaves you never. Every heartbeat, every fear, every shiver belongs to me, forever." A sudden gust of wind swept through, flickering the torches violently. Henry's shadow stretched, merged with the instruments, the chains, the walls. He became more than man. He became fear, a presence older than stone, alive in every corner, every echo, every mark of cruelty. The prisoners collapsed in trembling silence. Henry remained, towering, omnipresent, observing their terror, not in anger, but in ritualistic reverence. The chamber had been his domain, his cathedral of obedience, and even centuries later, its walls still remembered him. He turned towards the doorway, pausing. His shadow lingered, stretching impossibly long, a final silent warning. His eyes gleamed in the torchlight one last time, unflinching, omniscient, eternal. Then he vanished into the darkness beyond, leaving the chamber and its echoes behind. The torches continued to flicker. The chains rattled softly. The silence pressed heavy, yet alive, as if Henry himself lingered just out of sight. And though the doors of the palace would one day open to tourists, scholars, and historians, the chamber kept its secret. The instruments, the stains, the carvings, every trace whispered the truth. Henry VIII's obsession never ended. It endured, timeless, complete, terrifying. The legend of the king, who measured obedience in screams, remained. The shadow of his reign still stretched across centuries, unbroken, unstoppable, haunting every stone he had touched. And in the darkness, if one listens closely, one might still hear the soft, metallic echo of boots, the faint whisper of commands, the relentless presence of a king who refused to be forgotten.